The night she slept on a narrow motel bed with a flickering lamp, she finally understood what it meant to lose everything. The silk scarves were gone. The penthouse views were gone. All she had left was a single suitcase and a question she couldn't outrun anymore. Before we start, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and how old are you? And as you listen, ask yourself this. If you had all the money in the world but no one who truly loved you, would you give it all up to find one honest heart? Her name was Lorraine Whitaker, and for most of her life, money answered every problem before it finished forming. She built an empire in logistics, the kind of business no one brags about, but everyone depends on. By 62, magazines called her a self-made billionaire. What they didn't print was how quiet her nights were, how every dinner felt like a meeting, how every man who smiled at her eventually asked for something that wasn't love. You know that feeling when people look at what you have instead of who you are? That had been her world for decades. The breaking point came at a charity gala in Chicago. Lorraine stood in a room full of chandeliers and practiced laughter when she overheard a man she'd been seeing brag to his friends about locking down generational wealth. Not her. The wealth. She smiled through the evening, went home, poured a drink she didn't want, and stared at her reflection until the truth finally spoke back. If she stayed, this would be the rest of her life. So she did something that shocked even herself. She liquidated assets quietly, stepped down, and vanished from the circles that knew her name. No assistants, no drivers. Just a decision that scared her more than any risk she'd ever taken. Lorraine chose a place no one would expect her to be. A modest coastal town called Harbor Ridge. It wasn't famous. It wasn't flashy. It had wind-bent trees, a diner with chipped mugs, and a slow rhythm that didn't care who you were yesterday. She rented a small room above a bookstore and told the owner she was retired and tired. That part wasn't a lie. She bought her own groceries. She learned the weight of coins in her pocket. For the first time in her adult life, money didn't introduce her. If you were watching her then, you might have thought she was lonely, and she was. But it was a clean loneliness, the kind that makes space for truth. Every morning she walked the pier, listening to gulls argue and fishermen talk about weather like it was a living thing. That's where she noticed him for the first time. A tall, gray-haired man repairing a loose plank with slow, careful hands, as if rushing had been something he gave up long ago. His name was Thomas Reed. He was 68, widowed, and worked part-time maintaining the pier because he liked being useful. When Lorraine thanked him for fixing a board she almost tripped on, he smiled without looking past her shoulder, without scanning her clothes. Just a simple smile, like it was meant for her alone. That small moment stayed with her longer than it should have. They began to cross paths naturally, at the diner, at the bookstore downstairs, on the pier at sunset. Thomas talked about his late wife with a tenderness that didn't beg for pity. He asked Lorraine about her life, and she answered carefully, saying she'd worked too much and learned too late what it cost. He nodded like he understood regret as a language. If you've ever met someone who listens with their whole body, you know how rare that feels. Weeks passed, then months. Lorraine felt something unfamiliar growing, hope without calculation. She paid for coffee sometimes, and Thomas paid other times, and neither kept score. He invited her to a community potluck where the food was uneven, but the laughter wasn't. No one asked her net worth. They asked if she liked peach pie. She did. A lot. But here's where it gets complicated, and maybe you can already feel it coming. Lorraine hadn't told Thomas the truth. Not because she wanted to deceive him, but because she was terrified of losing the one place she felt seen. Every time she considered confessing, she imagined the shift in his eyes, the subtle distance. Would he still look at her the same way if he knew? One evening, standing by the water as the sky burned orange, Thomas reached for her hand. It wasn't dramatic. It was gentle. "I don't have much," he said quietly, almost apologetic, "but I know how to be steady." Lorraine felt tears rise because that was exactly what she'd been searching for. She squeezed his hand and said nothing about the secret pressing against her chest. Then the letter arrived. It was forwarded from her old attorney, who had finally tracked her down. Inside were documents that could pull her right back into the world she ran from. Assets unresolved, decisions only she could make. Thomas noticed the way her hands shook as she read. He asked if she was okay. Lorraine opened her mouth to finally tell him everything. Before she could speak, a sleek black car pulled up near the pier, completely out of place. A man stepped out, well-dressed, scanning the area until his eyes landed on her. He said her full name out loud, clear as day, the name no one in Harbor Ridge knew. Thomas turned to her slowly, confusion hardening into something else. "Lorraine," he said, not unkind, just stunned. "Who are you really?" And in that moment, with the truth standing between them and nowhere left to hide, Lorraine realized she might lose the one man who loved her without knowing her worth. Thomas didn't pull his hand away, but he didn't tighten his grip either. The space between his fingers and hers felt louder than any argument. The man from the car stopped a few steps away, clearly realizing he'd walked into something personal, but the damage was already done. Lorraine swallowed, feeling years of silence collapse into one breath. "I didn't plan for this," she said, her voice thin. "I was going to tell you, I didn't know how." Thomas looked from her to the stranger and back again. "Tell me what?" he asked, calmly. But there was a crack in it. Lorraine felt the old instinct rise, the one that negotiated deals and softened truths, but she pushed it down. If this was real, it had to be honest. "I used to run a company," she said. "A big one. I'm very wealthy." The word sounded ugly out loud, like it didn't belong in the salt air of Harbor Ridge. The stranger cleared his throat, apologized, and retreated, promising to return later. When the car drove off, the pier felt exposed. Thomas stared out at the water for a long moment. "How wealthy?" he asked, not accusing, just tired. Lorraine hesitated, then said the truth. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if he'd been carrying a picture in his head, and it had just been replaced with something heavier. "So all this time," he said, "you were pretending." Lorraine shook her head quickly. "I wasn't pretending to be someone else. I was trying to be just me, without the noise." She told him about the gala, the loneliness, the way money had distorted every relationship she'd ever had. She told him she stepped down because she wanted one thing she couldn't buy, a partner who chose her without incentives. Thomas listened, but the warmth in his eyes was guarded now. "Do you know how that feels from my side?" he asked quietly, "like I was part of an experiment, like you were testing me." That hurt more than anger would have. Lorraine nodded, tears finally falling. "I know, and I'm so sorry. If I could undo the lie by omission, I would." They didn't resolve it that night. Thomas walked her home, polite but distant, and left her at the door without the usual lingering goodbye. The room above the bookstore felt smaller than ever. Lorraine sat on the edge of the bed, the letter from her attorney unopened beside her. For the first time since she'd arrived, she wondered if she'd ruined the one thing that mattered. Days passed with no word. She saw Thomas on the pier once from far away and didn't approach. If you were her, would you chase him with explanations or give him space to decide? Lorraine chose patience, even though it hurt. She dealt with the legal mess quietly, resolving what needed to be resolved, making sure her past couldn't come crashing into Harbor Ridge again. One afternoon, the bookstore owner told her Thomas had asked about her. That small sentence felt like oxygen. Still, it wasn't until the town's annual cleanup day that they finally spoke. Side by side, picking trash along the beach, Thomas broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said, "about why this bothered me so much." Lorraine kept her eyes on the sand, afraid to hope. "I realized," he continued, "that it wasn't the money. It was the fear that you didn't trust me with the truth. Lorraine looked up then. I didn't trust myself, she admitted. I was afraid that if you knew, everything would change. And that says more about my scars than your character. Thomas nodded slowly. I'm not used to being the poorer one, he said with a faint smile. Pride sneaks up on you at this age. They talked for hours that day, not fixing everything, but understanding it. Lorraine made him one promise, that she would never hide again, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Thomas made his own promise, to judge her by her choices, not her balance sheet. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. It was quieter, stronger. The real test came when Lorraine told him she planned to use a portion of her wealth to fund community projects in Harbor Ridge, anonymously at first. Thomas worried people would treat her differently. Lorraine worried too, but she refused to live split in two. When the town eventually learned the truth, reactions were mixed. Shock, curiosity, gratitude. But Thomas stayed. He teased her about still hating peach pie crusts and reminded her to take out the trash on her assigned day like everyone else. Over time, their relationship settled into something deeply human. Mornings on the pier, evenings cooking simple meals, disagreements handled face-to-face, not buried under silence or gifts. Lorraine learned that love didn't mean shrinking herself, just sharing herself honestly. Thomas learned that accepting love sometimes meant letting go of old insecurities. The day Thomas proposed, it wasn't with diamonds or spectacle. It was with a ring his late wife had chosen years ago, offered with care and permission. If this feels wrong, say no, he told her. Lorraine laughed through tears and said yes without hesitation. Not because she needed him to save her, but because he stood beside her without trying to own her. They married in Harbor Ridge, surrounded by people who knew them as neighbors first. Lorraine didn't lose everything to find a good senior man husband. She lost the illusion that money could protect her from loneliness. And in letting that go, she found something richer than she ever imagined. If this story moved you, take a moment and think about what you're holding on to that might be costing you connection. Like the video, if it touched your heart. Share it with someone who believes it's too late for real love. And subscribe for more stories that remind us it's never about what you have. It's about who you choose to be with when everything else falls away.